To understand the long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine, we need to go back many thousands of years. This land, now known as the Levant, was once home to different ancient civilizations. It all started with the Canaanites, a group of people who lived around 3000 BCE. They built some of the earliest cities in the area and were known for their trading and craftsmanship. Their culture and religious practices became deeply rooted in the land, influencing those who came after them. Later on, around 1200 BCE, the Philistines, who were known as sea travelers, arrived and settled along the coast. They created 5 city-states, including Gaza, and were more than just warriors. They had their own culture, with advanced skills in making tools and art. Their conflicts with the Israelites were not just about land, but also about which culture would dominate. During this time, the Israelites also became a distinct group, living in the hilly areas around 1200 BCE. They were different because they believed in one God, which was unusual since most people at the time believed in many gods. The Israelites' connection to their land was very strong, especially to Jerusalem, which became their capital and the center of their religious and political life. The land wasn't just important for spiritual reasons. It was also a key area for trade and culture, making it valuable for anyone who wanted to control the region. The stories of the Canaanites, Philistines, and Israelites are more than just history. They are the beginning of the many claims to this land, with each group leaving a lasting mark on its identity. As the Israelites grew stronger, they formed 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as the capital of Judah. Under kings like David and Solomon, these kingdoms expanded their borders and became wealthy through trade. Solomon even built the first temple in Jerusalem, which was both a religious and political act, making Jerusalem the heart of the kingdom. However, this unity didn't last long. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split into Israel and Judah. Israel, with its capital in Samaria, was more open to attacks and eventually fell to the powerful Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. The Assyrians were known for their harshness, and they destroyed the kingdom, scattering its people, who became known as the Lost Tribes of Israel. Judah managed to survive longer, but wasn't safe either. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, attacked Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple, and took many people to Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian exile, was a major moment in Jewish history. It led to deep thinking among the Jewish people about their identity, their relationship with God, and the loss of their land. Even in exile, they held on to the hope of returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding their nation, a belief that would drive them for many years to come. When the Jewish people returned from Babylon and rebuilt the Second Temple in 516 BCE, it marked a new chapter in their history. But it was a difficult one. By 63 BCE, the Roman Empire had taken control of the region. The Romans allowed the Jews to practice their religion, but taxed them heavily and imposed their authority on Jewish political and religious life, leading to tensions. In 66 CE, the Jewish population, tired of Roman rule, rose in revolt. This struggle, known as the Great Jewish Revolt, lasted 4 years. But in 70 CE, the Romans, led by General Titus, captured Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. This was a huge loss, not just of a building, but of the central symbol of the Jewish faith. Despite this defeat, the Jewish spirit remained strong. In 132 CE, a second revolt led by Bar Kokhba aimed to reclaim the land. For a while, the rebels succeeded, recapturing Jerusalem and establishing an independent state. However, the Romans quickly crushed the revolt, and by 135 CE, the consequences were severe. The Romans renamed Jerusalem, banned Jews from entering the city, and scattered the survivors across the empire, beginning the Jewish diaspora. This spread Jewish communities far and wide, but the connection to the land of Israel never disappeared. Jewish prayers and traditions continued to recall Jerusalem and the hope of returning. This period of Roman rule and the scattering of the Jewish people marked a significant turning point, shaping the complex history of faith, identity, and power struggles over this sacred land. At the end of the 19th century, big changes were happening in Europe that would shape the future. One of these changes was the rise of Zionism, a movement that came from the deep desire of Jewish people to return to their homeland, a dream they had held on to for nearly 2,000 years. since being forced to leave by the Romans. Zionism wasn't just about religion, it was a response to the tough life many Jews were facing in Europe. During this time, Jews in Eastern Europe were facing a lot of hate and violence, with attacks on Jewish communities, known as pogroms, happening often. These hardships made many Jews look for a solution outside of Europe. Some thought they could blend into European society, but others believed the answer was to return to Zion, the biblical name for Jerusalem and Israel. Theodor Herzl, often called the father of modern Zionism, was a key leader in this movement. Born in Hungary and later living in Austria, Herzl was a journalist, but after seeing the strong hate against Jews, especially during a famous event in France called the Dreyfus Affair, he realized that Jews might never be fully accepted in Europe. In 1896, Herzl wrote a pamphlet called The Jewish State, arguing that Jews needed their own nation to live freely and safely. Herzl's vision was not just about religion or culture, but about creating a modern state where Jews could feel secure. Herzl's ideas resonated with many Jews across Europe. In 1897, he organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, marking the official start of the Zionist movement. The goal was to create a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured by public law. Herzl and his followers began working to gain international support to make this dream a reality. The movement quickly grew, and waves of Jewish immigrants, driven by both Zionism and worsening conditions in Europe, began moving to Palestine, which was then under Ottoman rule. These early immigrants, known as the First Aliyah, came to Palestine with high hopes but faced many challenges. The land was not the paradise they had imagined. It was underdeveloped and mostly owned by absentee landlords. The newcomers struggled to make a living, often working on farms or setting up small agricultural communities called kibbutzim. Despite the difficulties, these early Zionists laid the groundwork for what would later become a strong Jewish presence in the region, paving the way for future immigrants and the eventual creation of the State of Israel. While Zionism was growing among European Jews, a similar movement was starting among the Arabs living in Palestine and the wider Middle East. Arab nationalism, which began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a response to the weakening of the Ottoman Empire and the growing influence of European powers in the region. For a long time, the Ottoman Empire had ruled much of the Arab world, but by the late 19th century it was clear that the empire was falling apart. This led many Arabs to start thinking about self-rule and creating their own national identity. Arab nationalism was driven by a sense of cultural and political awakening, as well as a desire to push back against European control. Leaders and thinkers across the Arab world began calling for independence from foreign rule and for the unity of Arab peoples under a single national identity. At first, this movement wasn't focused on Palestine, but as more Jews began moving there, the local Arab population started to worry. Early resistance to Zionism among Arabs in Palestine was fueled by fears that Jewish immigration and land purchases would lead to the displacement of Arabs and the loss of their land. These concerns were not without reason. As more Jews arrived and began buying land, often from absentee landlords, Arab tenants were often forced out, leading to growing tensions between the two communities. During this time, organized Arab opposition to Zionism began to take shape, with protests, boycotts, and sometimes violent clashes. The situation was made worse by the involvement of European powers in the Middle East. The region was caught in a power struggle between Britain and France, who were eager to expand their control after World War I. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret deal between Britain and France, divided the Middle East into areas of influence, with Palestine falling under British control. This agreement, along with other colonial actions, left many Arabs feeling betrayed by the Europeans, who had promised them independence if they helped fight against the Ottomans during the war. As Arab nationalism grew stronger, it became more and more connected with the opposition to Zionism. Arab leaders and thinkers began to see Palestine as a key part of the Arab world, and the idea of a Jewish state in this territory was seen as a direct threat to Arab national goals. This tension between Jewish and Arab nationalist movements would only increase in the coming years. leading to the intense conflicts that would follow. The Zionist-Arab conflict took a major turn in 1917 when the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. Named after Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, the declaration said that Britain supported the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. While the wording was vague and full of diplomatic ambiguities, the Balfour Declaration was a big win for the Zionist movement. For the first time, a major world power officially supported the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. However, the declaration also included a critical note. It stated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This was meant to reassure the Arab population, but it only added to the confusion and tension in the region. To the Arabs, the Balfour Declaration felt like a betrayal, as if the British were giving their land to a foreign people. To the Zionists, it was a step forward, though they knew it didn't guarantee a state. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its territories were divided under the League of Nations mandates. In 1920, Britain was given control of Palestine, with the responsibility to carry out the terms of the Balfour Declaration while managing the territory. The British Mandate period, from 1920 to 1948, was marked by growing tensions between the Jewish and Arab populations. The British found themselves in a difficult position, trying to balance their promises to both the Zionists and the Arabs while keeping control over a volatile region. Jewish immigration continued to increase, especially in the 1930s, as Jews fled the rise of Nazism in Europe. This increase in refugees made the Arabs even more fearful of being displaced, leading to a series of violent uprisings, including the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a widespread rebellion against British rule and Jewish immigration. The British tried to calm the unrest with different policies and commissions, but these efforts mostly failed to satisfy either side. The Peel Commission of 1937, for example, suggested dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. But the Arabs rejected the plan, and the Zionists only reluctantly agreed. Later, British attempts to limit Jewish immigration and land purchases, like the 1939 White Paper, angered the Zionists, who saw it as a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration. As World War II ended and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, the world became more sympathetic to the Jewish cause. But the pressure on Britain to resolve the conflict in Palestine also grew. Tired from the war and unable to control the growing violence between Jews and Arabs, Britain eventually handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations, setting the stage for the next chapter in the complicated and tragic story of Israel and Palestine. World War II was a huge event that changed the world in many ways, but it was especially hard on the Jewish people. During the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed by Nazi Germany, marking the end of centuries of hatred toward Jews in Europe. This terrible event left deep scars on the Jewish community. For the survivors, many of whom lost their homes and had nowhere to go, the idea of creating a safe place for Jews in Palestine became more important than ever. After the Holocaust, many Jewish refugees tried to escape the destruction in Europe. Even though they knew life in Palestine would be tough, it was a place where they hoped to live without fear. At the time, the British were in charge of Palestine and were struggling to manage the situation. They had been trying to limit the number of Jews coming into Palestine because of the opposition from the Arab population. But after the Holocaust, it became harder to justify these restrictions. As more Jewish refugees arrived, the tension between the Jewish and Arab people in Palestine grew. The Arabs, who had been against Jewish immigration for many years, saw this as a serious threat. They were afraid that more Jews would mean they would lose their homes and land. This led to more clashes between the two groups, with both sides becoming increasingly violent. The Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, was determined to prevent another tragedy like the Holocaust. They worked hard to build their own state, creating groups like the Haganah and more extreme ones like the Irgun and Lehi, which fought against both Arab forces and the British. The British, overwhelmed by the violence and unable to satisfy both sides, realized they couldn't continue to control Palestine. As the situation worsened, the British tired from the war and wanting to leave the region, decided to ask the United Nations for help. This decision would lead to a crucial moment in the region's history and pave the way for the next phase of the conflict. In 1947, the newly formed United Nations took on the challenge of deciding what to do with Palestine. After months of discussions, the UN came up with a plan to divide the land into two separate states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. They also decided that Jerusalem, a city important to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, should be under international control to ensure that everyone could visit it. The UN Partition Plan, known as Resolution 181, was an attempt to find a middle ground between the conflicting dreams of Jews and Arabs. The plan gave the Jewish state about 55% of the land, including the Negev Desert and the coastal area, while the Arab state would get around 45%, including the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Jerusalem would be managed by an international body to make sure it was accessible to all faiths. For the Jewish people in Palestine, the UN plan was a significant, though not perfect, victory. Even though the plan didn't include all the land they wanted, especially Jerusalem, it provided a legal way to create a Jewish state. Jewish leaders, like David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan, seeing it as a historic chance to gain sovereignty. On the other hand, the Arab response was one of strong rejection. Arab leaders and the Palestinian Arab population felt the plan was unfair. They argued that it favored the Jewish minority, who made up only about 1/3 of the population, but were given more than half of the land. To them, the plan was just another form of colonialism, ignoring their rights and dreams. The Arab League, which represented nearby Arab countries, made it clear that they would not accept the creation of a Jewish state on land they considered theirs. When the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the Partition Plan on November 29, 1947, Jews in Palestine and around the world celebrated. But in the Arab world, there was anger and outrage. Instead of bringing peace, the plan only increased tensions and set the stage for the conflict that would soon follow. On May 14, 1948, as the British officially ended their rule in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish community, declared the creation of the State of Israel in Tel Aviv. Jews in Palestine and around the world rejoiced. After centuries of exile and suffering, they finally had their own country. But this joy was short-lived, as the declaration of Israel was quickly followed by war. Just hours after the announcement, the armies of 5 Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the new state, joining Palestinian Arab forces in an attempt to destroy Israel before it could fully establish itself. This brutal conflict became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Israelis refer to it as the War of Independence, while Palestinians call it the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. The war was chaotic and fought on many fronts. At first, the young and poorly equipped Israeli forces struggled to hold off the combined Arab armies. However, Israel's determination, along with disagreements among the Arab states, eventually turned the tide in Israel's favor. By the time the fighting stopped in 1949, Israel had not only survived, but had expanded its territory beyond what the UN Partition Plan had proposed. Israel now controlled 78% of what had been mandatory Palestine, including West Jerusalem, while the remaining land, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, was taken over by Jordan and the Gaza Strip by Egypt. The consequences of the war were significant and lasting. For the Jewish people, it was a great victory, the fulfillment of a dream that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But for the Palestinians, it was a disaster. About 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were forced to leave their homes during the war, either fleeing the fighting or being expelled by Israeli forces. These refugees, who thought they would return home after a short time, found themselves living in camps across the Arab world, unable to return to the land that was now part of Israel. The Nakba, or catastrophe, became a defining moment in Palestinian history, causing deep pain and loss. The dream of having their own state was left unfulfilled, leading to a sense of injustice and anger that would last for generations. The 1948 war also solidified the division of the land, with Israel becoming a sovereign state, while Palestinian hopes for independence were dashed. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, with its roots in this war, would continue to grow and change over the years, with both sides carrying the heavy burden of history, loss, and unresolved issues.